Hi, I'm Paul Feinberg, host of the UCLA Anderson podcast. I'm here today with Professor Marvin Lieberman, and we're going to talk about the bailout of the U.S. auto industry. Professor Lieberman, before we get into the specifics of the bailout and what's going on currently, can you briefly bring us up to speed, kind of let our audience know how we got to this point?
I think the big picture here is that the industry has been in a slow decline in terms of market share for several decades now, punctuated by these crises. Now, the crises are brought about either by a recession or by an increase in gas prices or both. The industry's got very high fixed costs, and in a recession, demand dries up. And so that means that profitability goes through the floor when you hit a recession. And also, when we have these increases in gas price, there's a shift in demand for cars. People want to buy smaller cars, typically. And the industry has typically been caught short during those periods. Now, the gradual decline in market share has really been more driven by the competition, largely from the Japanese. The U.S. firms, which were at one time the big three oligopoly, have lost out to the Japanese and increasingly to a global set of players. The Japanese brought in the 70s a set of practices that gave them much higher quality, much higher productivity. To Detroit's credit, over time they've been able to emulate most of those practices fairly well, but never really to surpass the Japanese. So I think over the long period, as competition has come in and put on this pressure, and Detroit has never quite regained its leadership. Its share has fallen, but we've seen these crises several times before.
You used the phrase big three. Anyone who's watching the news has seen the leaders of these companies speaking before the Senate, but the big three are not equal. They're not all the same. I thought it would be helpful if you could sort of discuss each individually and describe where they're at, maybe beginning with the Chrysler situation.
Okay, Chrysler, which is the company that was actually bailed out by the government back in the 1970s, is the smallest and for really its whole history the weakest of these three players. I mean, back in the 70s, we had a situation much like what we have today with recession, with high gas prices. And Chrysler was bailed out and ultimately saved by Lee Iacocca, who came in with a strategy which was designed to rationalize the production in just a couple of platforms with variety added on top. So it looked like Chrysler really had a very broad product line. He brought in the minivan, and for quite a number of years, Chrysler looked like it was revived and would be successful. But ultimately, the industry is such that it's become more global. The economies of scale are now really global in many respects. And Chrysler is, in my opinion, I think that the opinion of many others, too small to survive as an independent entity. So it was bought up by Daimler in the 1990s, a very badly executed merger. And Daimler has spun this back. Service, the company that acquired it, is in the business of basically fixing companies and putting them up for sale. So their strategy, presumably when they did this, when they bought it last year, was to repair Chrysler to the extent that they could and then shop it around for a buyer. Now the buyers are basically GM, and they talked a little bit before the crisis got so severe, and foreign auto companies. So, from the standpoint of Chrysler probably cannot survive independently. And an interesting issue that arises in this case is, how can it be repackaged? At this point, it's not clear exactly what the arrangement will be. Will there be a car czar, or ultimately, if the federal package fails, there may be a bankruptcy judge, which in some ways might give the company more flexibility, certainly politically more flexibility. I would be concerned if the government is involved in the restructuring of Chrysler. Could you really sell the company off to a foreign entity? That would seem politically unpalatable. Possibly you could split Jeep and the Chrysler, makes and, sell off one piece, but together, I think it may be problematic.
I think that GM is maybe the most interesting of the three. So maybe you could talk a bit about Ford, and then we can talk a little bit about where GM stands.
Yeah, Ford, just a few years ago, Ford was regarded as the sickest of these three players. But remarkably, they hired a new CEO, Alan Mulally, an outsider from Boeing, who came in and in just a couple of years has really started to restructure and revive the company. I mean, it shows how an outsider's perspective in many cases can be very helpful. He saw that Ford, like GM, had too many brands. They had acquired brands in Europe. They had brands in the United States. He sold off the Jaguar brand, the Land Rover brand, Aston Martin. He keeps talking about wanting to sell off Volvo and focusing Ford on its basic Ford brand, which I think would be a good idea. Now there are, as I mentioned, there are big economies of scale in making cars. I mean, Chrysler's got this problem, just being domestic limits its potential scale economies. Ford has strong operations in Europe and in the US, but historically they really haven't cooperated very much. For example, there's this car called the Ford Focus, which is sold both in Europe and in the US, but they are completely different cars. That's been true at Ford for many years. They've had cars by the same name, but they've been completely different. What Mulally did is said, look, we've got a successful Focus in Europe. It's a relatively high quality car. In the US, we have a Focus, which is very different. It's a cheap car. People aren't buying it. Let's standardize and actually focus the Ford Focus. He's done this. He's got the Fiesta is coming out. And so there's now a strategy at Ford that they seem to be implementing effectively, which is to actually tap into those global scale economies. Companies like Toyota, for example, would be able to exploit those. Toyota's got single designs that it rolls out worldwide, and Ford is going hopefully in the same direction. The other thing that Mulally did was, before the crisis got so severe, raised a lot of capital. So Ford has got a little treasure chest there that they're hoping will sustain them for the bulk of the crisis. They say that if the recession gets too severe, they will have to tap into the government funds.
Now, in GM's case, certainly they have huge problems for a company that size, and those problems have great ramifications. But it's possible something good could come of this. So, can you elaborate a little on that?
Right. In my view, the good that could come of this is the fact that we are in a crisis, and the current CEO, Rick Wagoner, has I think, pursued an effective strategy of incremental improvement there. There's been a lot of question whether that is sufficient, and certainly what we see today is it's not sufficient. I mean, he's improved labor relations. He has expanded the international operations to the point where GM's sales are now primarily outside of the United States. I mean, they've improved quality. They've hived off a lot of the retirement costs into a separate entity, which still they haven't fully funded. They got rid of the Oldsmobile brand, which was very difficult and expensive. But they've done a lot of the basic blocking and tackling that has made GM stronger, but they haven't really bitten the bullet in terms of the tough things to do. And here's where, I mean, having a crisis, having either a bankruptcy judge or an external government czar or whatever you want to call it, might actually help GM in forcing their hand, letting them do the tough stuff. And what is the tough stuff? Several things. One is that GM has got too many brands. I talked a little bit about Ford's brands. Ford, Mulally was able to winnow that down. GM has got it's Chrysler and Cadillac but in addition to those, which are brands GM would certainly want to keep, they've got Pontiac and Buick and Saturn, and GMC, and the dealers that are associated with all those brands. So what GM needs to do is to cut the brands, cut the dealers, and that's politically an extremely difficult thing. One factor is that the dealers are very powerful. They have a lot of influence in state legislatures. They have state laws that put them in a strong position. To eliminate the Oldsmobile brand cost GM $1 billion a few years ago. And so one thing that we could get out of the crisis is forcing GM, forcing the dealers, forcing the unions to all compromise in a way that still allows GM to survive. So in addition to the brand reduction and the dealer reduction, we've also got to have some kind of restructuring with labor. GM certainly has too many workers, probably will need some significant cutbacks. But it seems clear that GM could only be helped by the crisis atmosphere and external influence that would force them to make these major and very difficult changes.
If you were the car czar, or as Slate magazine called them today, the autocrat, what are some of the transformational things you'd like to see implemented, not just in the short term to get through the current economic crisis, but long term so that these companies become strong and viable down the road?
Right. I've already described some of the short-term issues that need to be addressed, and those are, in some sense, probably the hardest things to do. But at the same time, it's important to keep in mind, what do these companies need to look like in the future in order to be viable? If you look at the auto industry today, Toyota would be the example of the strongest company. And Toyota is a firm that's implemented efficient practices and quality and so on, but it's also pushed these days the hybrid technology effectively, and it's become a global company that is able to develop best practices and transfer best practices around the globe. So there is this sort of seamlessness of Toyota. Sometimes the company is described as a cult. I mean, they basically are able to implement the same ideas in various parts of the world. If you look at say, GM and Ford, GM is currently very fragmented. It's become very global, but the pieces are much less integrated. It's got some new technologies, and the Chevy Volt is often described as the panacea for GM. It's not going to be out for another year at least, so we'll see. They also have fuel cell technology. There's certainly a number of strengths there on the technological side. So trying to make effective decisions about where the auto industry is going technologically is really critical. GM has made many mistakes in the past. It's obviously hard to have a crystal ball on that. But for GM to use sort of this impetus that's now being provided on the technology side and to connect it with the things that are needed to make it an efficient global integrated player is really important. Ford seems to be moving in that direction, certainly not anywhere near as far along as Toyota is, but it does recognize that that's the place where it needs to go.